pages, that is beneficial to all of us. Okay.
Hello, and welcome to the 5th Biotensegrity Tea Party, sponsored by the Stephen Levin Biotensegrity Archive, Embodied Biotensegrity, and Handspring Publishing, with your hosts Chris Clancy, Susan Lowell de Salordner, and myself, Graham Scarr. This is part of a series of live events featuring a different author each week. And today we are pleased to welcome Handspring author Joanne Avison and guest interviewer Susan Lowell. Now, for those of you watching live on YouTube channel, please note that Handspring Publishing are offering a generous discount on the price of their books to those registered with the Biotensegrity Archive newsletter. So if you sign up, you can get details of books with a discount and preview of what's happening for the future events. So let's see the colour of your cups and glasses, and we'll commence the Biotensegrity Tea Party.
Hello, everyone. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. Graham, did you want to give an introduction to Joanne? Or did I miss that one?
Of course. Joanne Avison is a mother, artist, author, advanced yoga teacher, and yoga therapist, manual practitioner, and teacher in structural integration. Her master's degree is in spiritual sciences. As the author of Yoga, Fascia, Anatomy and Movement, published by Handspring in 2015, Joanne facilitates the ABC, Anatomy Basic course, that brings anatomy to life. Making sense of fascia and biotensegrity can transform teaching and learning experiences in movement and manual therapies. And Joanne's unique presentations distinguish our innate bioemotional intelligence. Honoring new fascia research and the ancient wisdom of sacred geometry, Joanne shows how body, mind, and being remain entirely unique and interconnected, inside and out. From considerable experience in the anatomy dissection laboratory with clinical anatomist John Sharkey, Joanne is able to make sense for both movement teachers and manual practitioners of how our own bodies are unique instruments that we can tune and optimize in our own archetypal ways. A graduate of the CMED Institute, Joanne asks, how can we help ourselves to live, breathe, and move better in harmony with nature, given our own nature and our unique archetypal shape on every level? Joanne invites us to ask ourselves compassionately, what shape am I today? So let's welcome Joanne Avison.
Hi, thanks, Graham. Wow. You said that, I'm thinking, who's he talking about? Do I just go, Susan, or am I waiting for somebody?
Well, I've got a question for you if you want, but why don't you just go and respond to Graham? Because one of the things he points out, Joanne, is how diverse your background is and what a gift and what a skill you have bringing everything together. So you can speak to the people in the sciencey fields, and you can speak to all people in other audiences. Go ahead.
They say necessity is the mother of invention, so I just invent ways. Yeah, I think, let me start a bit at the beginning. I was a recalcitrant school child. Not intentionally, I wasn't badly behaved. Quite the opposite. I wanted to please my teachers, but I was quite ill through some of my junior school years. So I ended up studying a great deal at home, and I had some gorgeous friends and some very devoted teachers who took time out to make sure that even though I was at home, I got to study on my own. And what that meant was, I, believe it or not, went very deep. I say believe it or not, because if my father was still here, he'd be laughing his head off at the idea that mathematics and algebra and calculus were one of my favorite subjects besides languages and art. And I was completely fascinated always by English and art and how we language our experience. It wasn't a very traditional education, but I did okay. And I ended up at university studying fine art and English as a combined course. But then I met my son's father, who was a chocolatier, a Belgian chocolatier. And I spent 20 years learning how to run a business, make life work for a group, and up to my elbows in chocolate, which didn't mean much to me when I started learning yoga, when I was very in a lot of pain when I had my son, when I was pregnant, and I went to have physiotherapy, and they laid me on a table that was split across the center and wrapped my shoulder girdle and my pelvic girdle to the table, and then opened the table, which is known as the fairly nasty sport of being hung, drawn and quartered in medieval times. And I studied the history that knew that, and I'm lying there going, well, I won't use the language that comes up. And it was the most painful experience of my life, being stretched, and it didn't help me, it made me worse. And I swore there has to be a more intelligent way to treat the human body, but I knew nothing about it. I couldn't even spell the word intuition back then. But being as anyone here who has children in their lives knows, and you know, our children teach us. I think we're the learners, they're the teachers personally. And I became a yoga teacher, and the big key thing was learning traditional anatomy, classical anatomy, and learning origins and insertions, and learning how the levers work through the form, and how we function as this biomechanical sum of our anatomical parts. And it didn't make sense of what I was learning in the classroom, which was restorative yoga. So it was the work of Vanda Scaravelli. And the thing about Vanda Scaravelli's training was that she declined to call it Scaravelli yoga. We've come to call it restorative yoga out of respect for her. Some people have, in my opinion, not shown that respect and call it Scaravelli yoga, but it was her heartfelt wish that everybody acknowledged that the yoga that they undertook was their own intimate, integrated, self-regulating process of awareness, albeit guided by the practices and the protocols. And I was taught by Pete Blackaby and John Stirk, and they were both osteopaths. So we had a very intensive emphasis on biomechanics. And one of the gifts of my life actually was being very early on in yoga, being given Mabel Todd's book, The Thinking Body. And it kind of set the tone for a future of questions. And I have to say, I was, what can I say? I found it very difficult to make sense of what I was learning in the classical anatomy books and what was actually happening in the movement classroom. And that gap was a source of distress for me, not least because I was openly embarrassed in class on several occasions. And at the time, and I think I talked about this last week, Chris, at the time it was horrible. Humiliation is always horrible. But I like to think of it as the grit that gets kind of scrinched, and it turns, if it gets stuck in your throat enough, it turns into a pearl. As it would in any oyster, a pearl begins as a piece of grit. And I think it's up to us to kind of transform those moments and really kind of take them personally and think, okay, what's here for me in life school? So by that time, I had decided that maths was fascinating. Fine art and English were amazing, but I wouldn't fit the box quite the way I was supposed to. Leonardo da Vinci was a genius. Making chocolates, didn't know why I was doing it, but I was a Belgian artisan chocolatier like Juliette Binoche, as Jaap van der Wal reminds me. And that I really wasn't sure why anatomy had to be a process of humiliation and degradation if I couldn't remember the details of it, to apply it to the body. And eventually that gap between the application and making sense, and I use that phrase very carefully, actually making sense of that anatomy, that gap is what I like to call the tensional that actually resonated my training. And I didn't know it at the time. I mean, it's no fun, I can tell you. But what began to happen is this incredible organic process of learning how the different threads come together, until eventually I created my own yoga teacher training school, the Art of Contemporary Yoga and the Science of Body Architecture. And at the time I began working for somebody called Nicola Brooks, who had a company called Bodywork, BPD, Bodywork Professional Development. And I did a series of webinars for her because I had been to the second International Fascia Research Congress, where I met Jaap van der Waal, who did his presentation for the first time in 25 years of the tissue sparing dissection of the human elbow. And I remember I was in Amsterdam, I had flu, I was holding myself together with as many drugs as I could. It was just chemical warfare in me, and I was holding myself up and I was holding my eyes open, and I had, God knows, I was so ill. And I was just completely captivated by Jaap. And I went round the back of the stage at the end of the presentation, and I just said to him, that was genius. Because it was the first time in my life that somebody had described something that made sense of my experience, as distinct from this list that I'm not making wrong. Please don't misunderstand me. I say to everybody, learn your anatomy so that we know where you are. But we have to understand the distinction between topography and topology. And I don't want to get off into long words and big subjects, but what that essence was, and I didn't know what it meant then. I don't, I want to keep this to the A, the story, and B, the process that we're in. But it's a very powerful distinction that when you take a London tube map, it tells you very clearly, topographically and color coded, where to go, which direction to go, and where things are in relation to other things. And that's incredibly important, because that is a topographical map, and that's what the anatomy books give us. However, one of the things that's happened is that we've inherited that classical anatomical basis as a collapsed distinction with structure, function, and qualitative assessment. We've collapsed the distinctions. And one of the tasks I think that we have to do as teachers, particularly of biotensegrity, most certainly of anatomy, is simply make the distinction between that map that tells us where we are and where we're about, and the distinction between that and the territory. They're different things. And I became fascinated by this notion of biotensegrity. As you know, I worked with Tom Myers. I was trained by Tom Myers. I met him in 1998. I'll never forget, he walked into our yoga studio and he was collar up and sunglasses on his head and his whole dude thing. And he just went, there ain't no muscle connected to no bone, nowhere in no body. Sorry, Tom, that's a crap Boston accent. But I mean, I just sat there and two thoughts. One was, oh my God, that man's just committed anatomical heresy in my classroom. Are you serious? And my second thought was, I want to study with anyone that can say that. So I was under Tom's spell immediately. And I studied structural integration. That was 1998 to 2000. And I became a structural integrator. And around that time, Tom was publishing Anatomy Trained. So I proofread the first one. So I heard of Mary Law and I heard of Serena Wolfard. And Tom spoke of them with great reverence, but didn't realize I was already an author with Cassell's and in a different field of art. And so I got to proofread the first Anatomy Trains and was completely fascinated by it. Because I proofread it, I kind of cut my anatomical teeth on this idea of continuity. And I'll say it to the day I die, Tom Myers cut and swathed a clearing in the forest for this dense anatomical insistence that if you didn't understand the origin and the insertion and the lever that moved that muscle moved to make that bone move, he cleared a clearing in the forest and bravely said, it's not that way. And he threw in the word continuity. He threw in the word meridian. And he did a lot of intellectual work, joining the dots of muscles in layers. And I did the first human dissection on the anatomy trains, and Tom left me to find the superficial front line. And I was like, are you serious? Do you mean to tell me that you've made these posters before you've done the, I was like, ugh. And it was like, okay, here we go again, back in my maverick education. And the truth is, we cut those lines out of a formalin preserved specimen. We didn't reveal them. There's no two ways about that. They were there to be cut. They made perfect sense in formalin, but that's one of the fundamental problems of the anatomy that we've inherited, the classical anatomy that we've inherited, is that traditionally bodies were cut into parts and all the fascia obviously scraped away. So those parts were what's called clean dissection, and that could be nerves, and that could be very, very beautiful dissection. Please don't get me wrong. But things like Gil Hedley's fuzz speech, which at the time was completely revolutionary, he has subsequently acknowledged the distinction that that is actually an artifact of formalin dissection. So what that means is, in all of this, with pioneers like Tom, who actually said, hang on a minute, it's different. There's continuity. There is an anterior and a posterior and a lateral and a spiral superficial sleeve. And inside that, there's what he calls a deep front line. He woke us up to something that mirrors the, if you like, Chinese medicine meridians, for example, and they are likened to the anatomy trains in some cases. They're in no way were they derived from them, but there is similarity. And I think one of the other things Tom did was, besides introducing tensegrity, was to bring the dissonance between East and West together, and ask us to consider that there is continuity, and it was a step from bits to bands towards wholeness, but it's not whole, it's linear. So we're still in this transition from, if you like, 20th century anatomy, what John Sharkey would call 21st century anatomy. We are in that transition, and as movement teachers, and I was among the first to teach anatomy trains in its own right and teach it to movement teachers, because I came to KMI not as a massage therapist as most people did. I had to do a bit to get in, but as a yoga teacher. So I came as a movement teacher, and what I wanted to know was, how does the so-called superficial front line express the deep front line? How are they separate? So I drove Tom mad, as I drive all my teachers, God bless him. And he always allowed me to challenge him, and he always allowed me to argue with him. And he told me, you will stand on my shoulders one day. And my whole education has been a story of trial by fire. And one day, if Tom reads this, I thank you, but it was trial by fire. It was tough. And Tom's the kind of, he's a challenger. He raised my game. I think he meant to. He pushed me very, very hard. And I eventually rose like a phoenix from the ashes. So I actually have to say thank you to Tom, as I think I do on my website somewhere, for that rigorous 5-6 years, I think it was, of being literally up to my ears in anatomy trains, and so grateful that I began to understand my basic anatomy in what I call joined up writing. Now, one of the things that Tom also did was introduce tensegrity. I don't believe he gets it, but sorry, Tom, I just don't. But I love the fact that he introduced it to me. He also introduced me to embryology, and I know we're going to have some arguments one day. I look forward to them. But we're all here to challenge each other, right? I know some of my friends commented on the first recording and how we all jumped in, and that's what we do at Big. We all talk to each other and argue with each other, and we're all friends because we're forwarding a new paradigm, and I think that's part of it. But to talk about tensegrity, I then, for Nicola, did a show on tensegrity, and I didn't know it, but Susan Lowell was watching my fascia talk shows, we called them. And I did a presentation on tensegrity. And I don't know if you can imagine, but when you prepare a presentation, I spend an awful lot of time. I'm not brilliant with PowerPoint, but I worked out this long PowerPoint presentation, and I had studied tensegrity, and I had questions and doubts, and I was confused by some of the things Tom had written. And I asked all sorts of questions, and I presented it as Dr. Levin's Biotensegrity, and I stole a picture of the pelvis, the ring pelvis, off his website. And I actually wrote, I have stolen this picture. I said it, I have stolen this picture off Dr. Levin's website. And I request that he doesn't murder me if he ever sees this, but it is his. And I quoted some things off his website, and I recommended everybody go through it. And I had this slide that said biotensegrity.com right in the middle. And then the last slide, I'll never forget it as long as I live, the last slide, Susan Lowell wrote in the chat box, because it was one of those Adobe webinar presentations. And Susan wrote, "Jo, I hope you don't mind, but Dr. Levin is watching this webinar." And I will never, you know, the thing they say at the last minute, everything of your life flashes before you. Every one of those slides went, and I was like, oh shit, did I quit? Oh my God, what did I, oh my God. And anyway, I got the most beautiful letter from Steve and an email the next day, and he said, let's meet. And I was just thrilled. And we met in 2012 when I also met Jaap van der Waal properly in Belgium, where Paul Seccu runs the big in Europe. But what happened was, in the meantime, I did what was due to be his class in London. I booked into it, and there was an ash cloud from Iceland over the country and nobody could fly. So Daniel Claude Martin came and taught it to us. And it was actually a really breakthrough special moment for me, because Daniel Claude is a movement teacher. I know she's a doctor of physics and all of that as well, but she's a movement teacher. And essentially she insisted that we experience the tensegrity as a structural felt sense experience. And she really crystallized that sense for me. And I was invited to come to Big, and kind of the rest is history. I just got more and more involved. And I remember one particular day, and this was one of the key moments in my life. And then I want to just go to handspring and talk about my book, but I've got to share this because it was gorgeous. What happened was, Paul Seccu, and we love you, Paul, if you ever hear this, he's like a kind of a professor type, you know, the scatty professor. And he forgot to book the Abbey for us all to do Big, where we go every single year. He'd just forgotten to book it. So at the last minute, and please bear in mind that I had been married to a Belgian, and my mother-in-law was Belgian, and Belgium is my second home. And so I love the Belgians. And we ended up in this castle. I don't know how, but he managed to rent a castle. It was the most bizarre. And Theo Jansen came and visited with all the little, what are they called? Can't remember what they're called, but his, just write it in the chat for me, Graham.
They're called strand beasts.
Strand beasts, that's right, strand beasts. And somebody, he didn't have one with him, they're too big, but somebody had some 3D printed strand beast. And that was the place that cinched for me the closed kinematic chains and the distinction between closed kinematic chains and wholeness and all various things, which I'm going to go to in a minute. We'll get to that in a minute. Don't let me not. But what happened there was, we had somebody there who was an osteopath who was talking about bending moment at the human knee. And I just stood there and went, well, that doesn't make any sense to me at all. Sorry. You know, I don't know why. I can't explain it. I don't know why. And God bless her heart, and I can't remember her name, but she did a 10-minute presentation, and it was Leonid, Steve, and me standing around this table. And you've got to understand, I'm like the little novice sitting there like a kid with a bucket. Just everything that was happening was going in my bucket. I was just holding everything. And she was explaining bending moment at the human knee and this entire osteopathic theory of biomechanical, this, that, and the other thing. And I just stood there and I just hung my head. I felt quite ashamed. I couldn't speak whatever that language was. And I said, I'm really, really sorry. I don't get it. It doesn't make any sense to me. If biotensegrity is true, how can there be bending moment at the human knee? And I'm ever so sorry. I can't add it up. I can't explain it. I haven't got the physics, because at that time I didn't know what an eigenvector was, or lots of other very complicated terms, but I don't get it. And Leonid turned around and said, well, of course you don't get it. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, I said, as far as I'm concerned, the body's in constant motion, the body, because it's alive, the body's in flow, the body's moving in spirals, the body's doing all these things that I said. And it makes perfect sense to me, but it doesn't make sense to me that it moves anything at a right angle. And I just can't make sense of bending moment. And I felt terrible because they didn't know what it was, and it didn't make sense to me. And Leonid said, of course it doesn't. And so this person asked Steve Levin to back up what they'd said. And Steve said, well, actually Jo's right, but she doesn't know why she's right. Because back then I didn't know why I was right. And I didn't know that I was right. And I looked at Steve and I said, if I'm right, how do I know? And Leonid turned around as only Leonid can. And he said, because you're a bloody chocolatier, that's why. And I went, what? And he said, you've been up to your elbows in a liquid crystal medium for 20 years. Of course you understand. And that was one of the gifts of my life, because not only did Leonid give me the opportunity to go back and make sense of my own history and use it to inform my work, but he gave me permission, which I think is something we need sometimes. We need to hear distinctions that resonate with us, that gives us a kind of inner permission to, I'm going to use this word carefully, and I'm going to tell you why in a bit, to acquiesce to life's lessons and make sense of them. And so I was able to pull my understanding of chocolate into my understanding of biotensegrity. And frankly, it changed my life. Now, fast forward to 2015, I by that time was working with Nicola Brooks and presenting Robert Schleip's work in the UK for several years. And then Robert asked me about my understanding of yoga and structural integration, which is obviously Rolfing by any other name, and anatomy. And I'd done quite a lot of anatomy by then in the lab. And Serena Wolfard by that time had formed Handspring Publishing and just came down to Brighton to see me and sat down and took one look at me and said, you're a practitioner. I didn't have red nails. I had hands that looked as if they treated people all day, and because they did. And we got on absolutely beautifully. And from that, this book was born. But this book was born, I have to tell you, and Handspring, Andrew, Mary, Serena, I thank you from the bottom of my soul. It was a year late. I nearly lost the contract doing it. It nearly killed me. Because my intention was not to write an anatomy book or to write a fascia book or to write a yoga book. It was to make sense of a yoga practice for somebody like me who didn't know where to start in learning the classical anatomy or the fascial anatomy or what the hell biotensegrity was when it was at home or anything. And so in a funny kind of way, I don't mean this egotistically, I just mean I was my own avatar. I needed to understand what I was doing. And in meeting and interviewing people like Jaap van der Waal and Robert Schleip and Professor Darrell Evans, who at the time was Professor of Developmental Biology at the Brighton and Sussex Medical School. And he was one of my key mentors. And he had this absolutely brilliant way. He's become provost of learning and teaching in Monash and New South Wales University in Australia now. But his genius, he let me come and do some of his medical school lectures where he created magic, but he taught me how to work with my audience, with my people, as he called them. And he said, there's absolutely no point in A, revealing how much you know, or B, blinding people with science, or bashing them over the head with the science behind the reason that makes you right. It's all you're going to do is you'll drive yourself mad and you'll drive them mad. He said, find a context and share that context with people and keep them excited, keep them interested, but work with them and they're listening. And that was one of the keys for me, because I'd obviously been studying yoga all this time and I've been studying meditation since I was 16 and so on. And by this time I had quite a good sense of what fascia was. I'd presented at the British Fascia Symposium for Jan Trewartha, and I'd done various things. And I realized that I wanted my book to honor the fascia from the point of view of how a liquid crystal behaves. And a liquid crystal, i.e. chocolate, is absolutely devoted, your handling of it, your craftsmanship of it is based on understanding timing, temporality, temper, that we could call temperament, and tempo. You have to have the right rhythm, and you have to have a sort of a sixth sense. And one of the things that I realized through all of this work of making models and working with people and teaching yoga, which was one of the most profound things for me to do in life, it was to teach something that doesn't just teach movement, it teaches stillness. And I think this is very important. And a lot of people have said to me, why did you call your book Yoga, Fascia, Anatomy and Movement? Why didn't you call it Fascia, Anatomy and Movement? Because it's such a, so focused on the fascia and biotensegrity. And my answer to them was partly because yoga gives me license to talk about spirit. And when I say spirit, I don't mean a particular spiritual following or a religious following. I don't mean that. I mean the animus that animates this. That's what fascinates me. Because when you're in the cadaveric lab, as you know, what's present as missing is the spirit. So I'm like fascinated, and studying at the CMed Institute with Carolyn Mace was all about learning archetypes. I'm fascinated by how the shape we're in is distinct and unique. And what makes us all the same is that we're all unique. So I could express that through yoga. The other thing I could express through yoga was some of the mystery school work that I'm trained in, because yoga, advanced yoga in philosophy is very much based in ancient mystery schools. And it was about discovering for me that the mysteries are not so mysterious. They were just very cleverly and beautifully couched in a language that was appropriate at the time, to the people it was being taught to. So the Vedic sages had levels of language. They used language very specifically and very beautifully. And they had levels of language that were representative of resonance to the postures. The name of every posture has a resonance. And that resonance was taught to people at the level they were ready to reach, so that they weren't overwhelmed with knowledge. Like if you go to a child and you teach a child all about the end of the world and what we're doing to our environment, and you dump the whole COVID-19 story on them at the moment, the children are overwhelmed. That's not what we do. What we're trying to do is keep the children cognizant of the limits in an appropriate way. So we help them stabilize themselves, if you like, and be dynamic within the appropriate constraints of the situation. And obviously I'm speaking symbolically about biotensegrity, but it's not appropriate to dump on them all the science. And what I began to find after I'd strived so hard to understand the science and study the geometry and study the mystery schools, and then go into things like eigenvectors and trigonometry and sound wave patterns and superstructures and neutrinos, and I can't even tell you how many different details of stuff. I mean, the stuff I've read does my head in sometimes. It really exhausts me. But you can't dump that. So one of the reasons for making it a yoga book was that the yoga theme ran through it, and the theme that runs through this first edition is very much based on, first, the intellectual information, the history of the fascia, why fascia was missed, the understanding that's needed to realize how significant fascia is. Fascia is not new. We didn't invent fascia. 200 years ago, John Godman was asking for it to be recognized, and 100 years ago, Andrew Taylor Still was asking for it to be recognized, and writes of it so beautifully. It's fascinating. But what happened was René Descartes did a turf deal with the Pope to get permission to do dissection at all on human bodies, which was an advance in fathering science. And the Pope did a deal. And the turf deal that the Pope did, you can read all about it in Candace Pert's Molecules of Emotion. The turf deal that was done with the Pope, the church retained jurisdiction over the body, the mind, the spirit, and all the invisible forces. And the science that was growing from this philosophical origin could have jurisdiction over the body. And that was the rift in Western science that divided the body from the being. So we study the body as if it's distinct from the invisible forces of being, of nature, of feeling, of sense, and sensory awareness, and the subtlety of anything outside of the intellectual mind that wants to measure everything and is very focused on quantitative measurements thereof. So what I was able to do in the book was make then the second part about the instinctive moving body. And the language that we describe the instinctive moving body from is completely different to the language that we use intellectually. So intellectually, I might say to you, oh, you've got carpal tunnel syndrome, and what's going on with your carpal bones is, and this is your carpal tunnel, and these are the tendons, and the fascia's doing this, and the blah, blah, blah. And my client can look at me going, My client's language is, this hurts. But in yoga, it doesn't necessarily hurt, but can we translate that language into how we experience the feeling of how, for example, we use the wrist in dog pose, or overuse the wrist, or when we flex or extend the wrist, what's the language we can use, the proprioceptive language? And it's a very different language at the instinctive moving center. And then, of course, the third thing in the book enabled me to go into the intuitive aspect of our awareness of that. And what that brought me to was recognizing for myself that the microcosm, the inner world, the macrocosm, the what we see, the form that we see, the visible stuff, and the cosmos are all reflections of each other. And there ain't no way that Mother Nature changed the rules for this bit of the in-between. They all have to be the same rule. Mm-hmm. And the thing that came to me from Biotensegrity that made so much sense is that everything we are is round. We're round, we're rounded, we're volumes. And Biotensegrity, for me, is not an explanation. No, let me say this again. Biotensegrity is not a movement theory. It's not a structural theory. It is not even really a paradigm. I've said a long time it's a paradigm, but I've corrected that. I've been thinking so hard about it. Biotensegrity explains human or natural movement of living things. Now, one of the things that's happened recently, and I mentioned this the other night when we were working together, is that somebody who said that I'm a doctor of physics, and I know that the using of tensegrity structures as pedagogic tools is all very well, but you know, anybody that thinks this is representing a bone and this is representing a muscle, it's wrong because, well, here's the honest truth. I watched the first bit of that video and I couldn't sit still because I had to pace the room because I was ranting. And my rant was, do you really think we're that stupid? Really? Let's start off with, this is a model of forces, not form, forces. You don't cut bodies open. And since then, I've done a lot of human dissection with John Sharkey. And of course, we're working with soft fixed cadavers. So we don't have fuzz. We have these filmy, non-layered continuities that follow precisely the rules of soft matter. And this is where we have to do something that I'm going to call crossing the Rubicon. And that's the difficulty in understanding biotensegrity. And I say to this professor of, or doctor of physics, you have to come and understand biotensegrity before you slag it off on behalf of the people that we're teaching. Because to start with, to understand this as a force dynamic system, showing that there are at least two forces, actually this represents three, but we'll get to that in a sec. This body is round, and round things, and I've got a balloon here, this is a round thing. We start off as one cell, and that one cell is inside, starts off as a, I'm not going to say corona radiata, it's whatever, it's a zona pellucida when it's a conceptus, and then inside that everything else happens. And everything's done in round things, inside round things, inside round things, folding, invaginating, one piece of fabric, one fascial matrix, folded, enfolded, enfolding, surrounding, rounded in the round. It's round. Breath is round. Bodies are round. So what we need to explain round things is something designed to explain how round things are, how round things move, and what round things can do. But at the moment, I think we're a little bit stuck in, these are the movement disciplines that we have, be it athletics, be it, I don't know, Feldenkrais, be it Amatsu, be it yoga, be it Pilates, be it whatever, or these are the manual disciplines that we have, let's list them. They're not separate. They're all one. They're about how we relate to each other. And so far, we've had a two-dimensional topographical map from which to do that. But what we can do with Biotensegrity is cross the Rubicon. Now, a rubric is not so much a quantitative assessment. A rubric is more a qualitative assessment of how things are done. And a rubric can also mean that you just went over someone's email and marked it in red. Because crossing the Rubicon actually comes from a Caesar in 49 BC, crossing the Rubicundus is the word from Latin. He crossed a small stream in the Adriatic coast, and the coast, the fabric of that coast was red, and it was ruddy red. It was the color of the soil on its banks just before he attacked Pompeii, and it came into our language as crossing the Rubicon, crossing the big divide. And what we're doing now is we're crossing the big divide from 20th century anatomy to 21st century anatomy, and from the anatomy of 2D levers, which are non-existent in biologic forms. We're non-linear biologic forms. We know that. This is one of Steve's mantras. There are no levers in non-linear biologic forms. All living biologic forms are non-linear. Therefore, there are no levers. Amen. There are no levers in non-linear biologic forms. That's flowers, fauna, trees, leaves, anything in nature that grows that is self-assembled. There are no goddamn levers. Now, that has got us to where we were, and it's not going to get us to where we are. And what we have to do to get to where we are is find a language that explains that this is a model of the forces acting on this. And that what's in that is a balance of tension, compression, and their combination in a particular pattern. A particular pattern. This is a tensegrity model. It's a particular pattern. It happens to be the Star of David when you look at it at the end. It's actually a sacred pattern. It's a pattern of sacred geometry. And it happens to be part of the pattern when you draw consciousness, which you're trained in at spiritual science school. And this is a particular pattern. There are many varieties of that pattern. Graham has made me, as he's made all of us, I think, some of the most beautiful models. But these are not models of sticks and strings. They're models of the force of tension and compression. This one arrived broken, and at first I was upset, but like all bits of grit, it turned into a pearl, because when you mend this one, it self stiffens.
Mm-hmm. And Joe,
yeah,
I'm looking at the time now, and we've asked people to now would be a good time for people to add their questions to the chat box. But I have a question for you, and that is, you talked about this shift from two-dimensional to round and omnidirectional. And a lot of people, it's a hard shift to make, because we see people coming across that all of the time. Do you have recommendations for people? How do I start? Where do they start?
Well, if we start with fascia, and you asked me, Susan, to talk about the fact that people think fascia and biotensegrity are the same thing, not the same thing, apply to each other, don't apply to each other. The living body is biotensegral. It is anyway, whether you get it or not, whether you understand what biotensegrity is or not. Tensional integrity with tension, compression, and tension, compression is the explanation of how this is round, because it's a pre-stressed system. In other words, you are formed by these cellular spheres pushing against the outside wall and the outside wall pushing against the cellular spheres. That is a map of that force transmission.
Mm-hmm.
So when the embryo forms and it starts as a bud, and the pre-plan, the enlarge of what's going to be bone, which is cartilage, grows 8 times faster than the surrounding tissue, it is formed under tension. So biotensegrity explains the nature of the fascial matrix that we are. It's all fascia. And you can argue till Christmas. There is so much evidence suggesting that this is basically fascia expressing different properties, different qualities, different elements. Now, I couldn't agree with you more, Chris, how difficult this is to explain and describe just this far.
Mm.
And this is why I'm back to our physics professor, or physics doctor, who complained that we're trying to oversimplify by saying these are muscles and bones. No, these are symbolic models of how bones tension myofascial continuity.
Right, and that's something we can really feel when we build tensegrities.
We can feel it when we build tensegrities. When my broken tensegrity, I give this to my clients and I mend it and they see it. Look, you can see it. See how it moves?
Mm-hmm.
And all I'm doing is mending the one broken strut and it moves completely differently. It self-regulates, as it were. Now, I know this is not a biologic form. This is a tensegrity, not a biological one, not a living tensegrity, not a biotensegrity. But this has completely different resonance. It's tuned differently when it's appropriately balanced. Now, I'm going to give you one of my pet peeves now. One of my pet peeves is that one of our jobs is to explain, as teachers of biotensegrity, how physical laws work. Because we've inherited Borelli's idea of levers, and they are 2-bar open chains, and there are no 2-bar chains, there are no single planar movements in the body, and there are also no open chains. There's no open 2-bar chains anywhere. Everything's joined to everything else. So just at the most basic level, the engineering doesn't work. You know, my father said to me, go back to the basics. How can there be levers in biologic forms? And because I said to him, this Stephen Levin guy says there's no levers in non-linear biologic forms, Dad. And he goes, yeah, that makes sense. We're round. I was like, let's get back to the simple basics. And that's what I try to do. Now, let me give you my pet peeve. And I'm accusing as well as, and sorry guys, but you can have a go at me afterwards. I get really upset when I hear the phrase non-Newtonian and non-Newtonian physics and non-Newtonian liquids. And there are videos out there about how what's in here is non-Newtonian liquid and how we are designed by non-Newtonian physics. Sorry, Newton was a genius. Newton was a genius, in my opinion. He might have been an ordinary man, but he was a mad alchemist and he was a genius, as was Leonardo da Vinci. Now, in Leonardo da Vinci's drawings, the hidden geometry that if you're trained to see it, you can see worlds within worlds within worlds. Newton also hid what he was teaching within his teachings. And he gets quoted as having said that the apple fell out of the tree and he discovered gravity, and that's not true. Newton watched from under a tree the fact that the apple hung, and knowing that the earth is rotating in the galaxy and round the sun at some speed, you know, hundreds of thousands of miles an hour. I don't know what the exact number is because it's gone out of my head. Why wasn't the apple spinning? Why wasn't it hanging at an angle? That's a great question. And when we talk about non-Newtonian fluids, what you have to remember is that the body is 60 to 70%, 80 if you're a baby, percent water. But it's not liquid running water. Urine's the only liquid water in the body that's got the consistency of my tea. It's bound water. And I actually love John Sharkey's definition that the biotensegrity is the model that binds, and it's the model that binds all the other models because it's the model that explains motion. of living things, and the earth is a living thing. So it explains the motion of the planets, it explains the motion of the cosmos, it explains the motion of the body, and it explains the motion of the inner cosmos. Now, how far do we go explaining that motion so that we don't get criticized for starting at point A to learn what's the difference between this and this? And as you say, Chris, building the models is so valuable. These are identical, by the way. They are both Manhattan toy company Tensegra toys, designed by Tom Flemons, God rest his soul. And this one has its property of elasticity, and this one doesn't. Now, that's not because it's made of elastic bands. There's a major misunderstanding. What does elasticity mean? This one, my beautiful Tensegrity mask that Bruce Hamilton made, doesn't have any elastic components, but it has elasticity. It bounces and it resists deformation in any position. I push it, it pushes back at me. I pull it, it pulls back from me. I bend it down, it pulls up. I bend it up, I twist it, it counter rotates. Mm-hmm. And these principles of spiraling counter rotation are what Newton was trying to discover. And what Newton did was he invented calculus, because at the time he couldn't allow, or he had the genius to find a way out of, being reduced to philosophers' descriptions and imagination. And it wasn't de trop to use your imagination. And he was ridiculed as the great geometer. Blake did a painting of him as the great geometer with a set square coming out the clouds as a beam of light.
So one of the things we do in the Biotensegrity Archive newsletter is we put in some, like Joanne recommends, Steve says. So if you have a book reference for that, I'm sure people would love it. I've also promised to read some questions, take questions from the audience, and we have 7 minutes left. So I'm going to interrupt you and just read you this question from Anastasi, who says, Joe talks about fascia as the base along which other cellular structure develops, example, muscle, ligament, bone, etc. Are you in this idea also saying that in the embryo, as the heart transitions from a more, oh shoot, it just zipped away.
It's okay. John Clarkey's answered it. It's he's ahead of the game and spot on, but dictated by the evolving microtubules. It's the whole thing is happening in the round, Anastasi. So it's folding and enfolding and unfolding via the fascial matrix. The architecture of all of it is the fascia. So this is where it gets so difficult, when we get stuck on very specific things. And what I was wanting to say is that we have to, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. And I think we have to be very careful how we lead people through biotensegrity in terms of understanding the basics, the fundamentals. We are round. How do closed kinematic chains work? What do we mean by everything we move moves everything else because it's under tension? And then what I think we have to do is move into the more the other parts of dynamic movement, and keep in mind, and this is why I wrote the book that I wrote, that the other side of that, the opposites, which biotensegrity incorporates. Biotensegrity honors and incorporates opposites. Mm-hmm. It doesn't reduce to one or other. It's both, all together. Tension, compression, form, tension, compression, volume. And this is really important in teaching yoga, because we're teaching stillness. We're teaching dynamic stillness. We're teaching the power to still, to be still, because yoga poses are just designed to free up the body, do something a bit like pandiculatory stretches and yawns, and then prepare you for sitting in absolute stillness, stilling even the mind chat, and then becoming conscious of the inner cosmos, the innerness. And that ability to achieve stillness is why my book starts with the word yoga, because there's a whole section in there called The Inner Sense of Fascia. It's chapter 18, and it talks about finding the depths of our inner world, and they arise in balance. Mind and body become quiet and still. Being, the immeasurable and qualitative essence of us, is nourished by our presence. And I think this is the theme, not just in yoga, in Feldenkrais as well. I joined today, Anastasi, you'll be proud of me. And I think it was it Cynthia Allen? She posed a question today saying, what word would bring people into this place where we can start understanding the subtleties on the spectrum from, if you like, loud to soft. I'm putting words in her mouth, but this is what Biotensegrity does. It allows us to understand resonance on a spectrum of volume control, from loud to soft, from big to small. Let me finish, just let me finish my sentence. And the word that words are so important to me, as you know. The word that I'm going to bring forth is the one that John Sharkey put up this morning, which was quiescence. I'm going to ask John, even if he has to wait till the hour, to talk about that word, because quiescence, there's just so much to talk about the emergent properties in the body and how the emergent properties bring about new emergent properties moment by moment, which is all about what chocolate's about. But we have power over them.
Oh, something odd is happening to the sound.
The network is very low.
I'm not sure what's going on.
You guys, everybody unmuted. So
I think it sounds like somebody
Has somebody unmuted and
is unmuted.
they've got their phone and it's giving you reverb, their phone and their computer.
Okay, I'm going to mute everybody, and you and Graham,
Oh, I see it.
are you going to be able to do that?
I did it.
Thank you.
Yeah, the words.
Also,
the words
because of the time,
yeah.
we need to do a station identification.
Okay.
So anybody who has time to hang out afterwards, we stay on after the hour, but we make sure that at the hour mark, we have a few things that we get in, which I think, Graham, you have, right?
Yes, I want to thank Jo ever so much for this presentation. It was just wonderful. And we didn't get a chance for you to answer all the questions we had. So, but we're still on Zoom for the next half hour. I think possibly YouTube as well. So there'll be more informal questions and you can answer more from that. I just want to thank our sponsors, which is Stephen Levin Biotensegrity Archive, Embodied Biotensegrity and Handspring Publishing, who have all joined together to make this event happen. Next week, we've got Stephen Levin and Leonid Bliam talking and presenting some new frontiers on Biotensegrity. This has only been around for the last few months. It's really exciting where it's taking us. So they will be introducing these new things. So if you want to be part of the Zoom meeting, you need to join the Biotensegrity Archive newsletter and sign up, register for the meetings. You also get a discount code for Handspring books, which is very generous. Okay, and I must say that.
Yeah, and that's at biotensegrityarchive.org.
Yes, that's right.
Mm-hmm.
I must say that I introduced the interviewer as Susan Lowell. It was actually Chris Clancy. So
we didn't really need to have an interview because we talked about what we wanted to cover, and you've really covered all those questions anyways. So thank you.
Did come in advance, so I made sure I did.
Yeah, no, you did cover everything. And I'd be interested in knowing, Jo, you talked about meeting Danielle Claude, who I was.
Can I get a technical point in before we switch?
Yeah.
I just want to say, Chris, since we're past the hour, it's still on YouTube. It's on just Jo, spotlight view, but maybe for when we're doing questions, we could have, or at some point soon, we could go back to a more gallery view or mixed speaker view or whatever it is, which I think, Chris, you have the power to change.
I think you can just spotlight whoever's talking so that anyone watching it afterwards doesn't have to look at the whole screen.
I think I've got it on speaker view. I'll wait for Mariana. If you're out there, will you check out YouTube and let me know if it looks good?
I have YouTube up. I'm monitoring it.
Okay.
And it's not on speaker view. I think it's on a spotlight where no matter who is.
Oh, okay. I know what I need to do.
Yes. Thank you. Sorry.
How's this? Better now?
YouTube has a 10-second delay, so
Okay. Well,
talk again, Chris.
Well,
Talk
we're waiting for that. I just want to thank everybody for their patience with our technical learning curve. We seem to be on a bit of a roller coaster, but if I look back a year, we're doing much better. So it's generally getting better, I think, along the way. Better?
Yeah, what I still have on YouTube coming up is Joe spotlighted, no matter who's speaking.
Sorry.
She's not spotlighted here. It's okay. You look lovely, Joe. I'm
Yeah,
going
you
to unpin the video. It's not pinned, Mariana.
Can you
Yeah.
speak? Can you switch to gallery view?
I can. But now we can't really see the main speaker.
Yeah,
So
still not showing up on YouTube in gallery view. Hold on.
maybe Anastasi can unmute and guide us through this.
It is on mine. It is
Okay,
on.
great.
It's on gallery.
Yep, now
Can
I got it
try
too. It did-
speaker? Should we put it on speaker view? Then can see what happens if I do that. Then you can see the speaker, Anastasi. You have to give your 10-second lag. Wait, you're muted. I can't hear you.
No, I'll let you know as soon as it switches. But right now it's still on gallery. There we go. Speaker
Nope.
now.
Yep.
Okay. So thank you all for your patience with this. I am lost about where we were.
I'll pick
I
it up.
think
I was going
Joe-
to say to Wilbur, Wilbur said elasticity is not about elastic bands. I did say that. I made it very clear that elasticity is not about elastic
Yes, you
bands.
did.
And that this is not made of elastic bands. It's about a particular pattern. And what I wanted to say was that everything in biotensegrity is what the yin yang is about. It's what in yoga, the Ida Pingala, masculine and feminine, is about. And when they are combined, we have three forces. We have masculine, feminine, and what arises when they are in balance is Shushumna, is the neutral. So when we talk about an atom and we talk about electrons and we talk about the protons, we don't often hear people talking about the neutrons, which are an essential part. And in fact, you can go into the science of that and the fact that hydrogen is the only element without a neutron. And this is significant in our understanding of molecular structures. And I can wax lyrical for hours about the molecular structure of water and how there are 4 phases, not 3, and so on and so forth. But what I think we have to do first in biotensegrity, because it's a reach, we have to cross the Rubicon. We have to acknowledge that we are in 4 dimensions to see 3. We have to be in 5 to see 4. And what we're trying to do, and this is what all I wanted to finish with, was that we're trying to look at our own eyeballs. So we have to kind of get out of our own way to look back at our own eyeballs to make sense of our structure. And it's changing constantly, and change is the only constant. And that, my darlings, is the paradox of fascia. And if you and fascia as a tensegral structure, a biotensegrity when it's living.
I think that's one of the challenges, is because we are so trained in our mind to categorize in black and white, we really have to get beyond that to be able to embrace the paradox.
We do, but I think we have to find language, and you know how nutty I am about language. We have to find a language, and the term I was wanting to reach at the apex of this meeting, and I'm sorry I went over, is one that John Sharkey uses, is quiescence. And the reason I love quiescence, and I love it, is it refers to, I said acquiescence at the beginning, just like proprioception is the same root as appropriate. Fascia is it's called our 6th sense. I think it's our primary sense. We now know it's the largest sensory organ of the body. It allows us to sense subtlety, subtle resonance. And what biotensegrity allows us to do is explain subtle resonance. We can be powerful, we can be subtle, we can be dynamic, we can be still. And all the awarenesses in between are because we are biotensegral. Biotensegrity explains that. And quiescence for me, why it's such a beautiful word. And I saw it today on Facebook when I joined Cynthia Allen and saw the questions and the answers. And I was on the phone to John, and John, I want you to speak to it if you're here. Is this subtlety of awareness that we bring, that we come from. And we set the tone literally and symbolically at the physical level and at the structural level and at the resonance level and at the intuitive level, body, mind, and being. We set the tone. We tune up one of nature's finest instruments, which is the living body, and it does it with consciousness as well. And that's where I think biotensegrity will begin to come into its own, when we understand it physically, when we understand it emotionally, and when we understand it psychologically, and then we understand it as the anima animus expressing itself. And what I think we've got to be very, very careful to do at this early stage is remember, it's what makes us all the same. It's nature. It's in nature. And I think we've got to be very careful about going off into the deep mathematical tangents and the rabbit holes of deep philosophical blah blah and you know, eigenvectors, for example. It's a journey that we have to take very, very steadily. And first we've got to acknowledge where we've come from, make sense of our topographical map of anatomy that I recommend everybody does, because it's your guideposts, it's your signposts. And then we're starting to teach about the territory. And yes, fascia is very important. Fascia is biotensegral. It is under tension. It is a pre-stressed system. And then we begin to understand what that means. And then we start making sense of what the models are models of.
I think it really also is this collective flocking principle that Neil was talking about, where those people who are really drawn to the mavs do that in Excel, people who are in their body do that. And then we each kind of bump each other to grow together. But John,
we have
I know Joe.
can I just say also, we have a number of questions backed up, so I want to make sure we get to some of great.
John, did you want to respond to that? And then we're going to start going through these questions.
Joanne gives me, you know, a lot of credit. I actually believe that I'm trying to remember where I heard that word, and I think that word was given to me as a gift as part of my journey from Michael Shea. So please look up the work of Michael Shea. He does beautiful work on embryology, and he's also involved in craniosacral applications. So Michael, if somebody spreads the word to you, I hope you get to hear about this, because it's such a beautiful word. And I think, in fact, one of the most amazing utilities of human function, one of the most amazing gifts that nature gives us, is the ability of stillness. And when you don't have stillness, if you can imagine somebody who has a twitch, you know, constantly doing this and has no way to control that, my goodness. Or with Leonid working with the cerebral palsy, and they just have complete and utter, you know, a collapsing. And so it's this dynamic stability and avoidance of instability. Yeah, Joe, speak a little bit about that perhaps. And that's really what we're talking about in tensegrity and biotensegrity specifically. It's about the balance, not equalness, because there's a hierarchy here, but it's about restoring balance to the system, the balance between tension and compression. The language can change if you go into, you know, if you move more towards the nuclear side, you're talking about repulsion versus attractions, and that whole area of physics is changing. I mean, it's changed rapidly in the last 5 or 6 years. So I think we are only to expect that our understanding of anatomy, human anatomy, and the explanations is also going to change. I mean, if it hasn't changed, there's something wrong. So we need more people to embrace the biotensegrity model.
Will you please write the name of Michael Shea in the chat for everybody? We've got questions about that. And Connie, you have a question. Do you want to speak out loud, or do you want me to say it, read it for you?
Please look at Michael Shea's work. What a beautiful human being. And he also speaks from the work of Blacksmith. So yeah, check him out.
Okay, and Connie's
His name is
question.
Chris.
Go ahead, Susan, yeah?
I don't think I said anything. I have
Oh.
a question, but
There's a question from Connie, and can I read it?
yeah.
This is for Joe. I believe this is for Joe. What do you believe about homeostasis? And Connie, go ahead, Joe.
I think that's what I'm going to read you a piece, because what John just said is this is just out of my book. Sorry, but I wrote it, so I might as well read you a piece out of it. Finding the depths of our inner world from deeper within it is the purpose of meditative practice. It offers a profound stillness as the natural counterbalance to activity and motion. Tension and compression forces combine to create multiple forms together in biotensegrity architectures. Silence can counterbalance sound here, uniting the active and the passive elements within us. Something else can then occur when the apparent and the inapparent unite to form a transparency. It is something we can see through rather than something we can see. And I say that because homeostasis isn't a thing. It's a balance. And I love the French word équilibre, because equi is equal and librare comes from freedom. So it is the freedom of poise or equipoise at any given moment. And that changes appropriately with the time, the temperament, the temperature, the tempo, and everything else. And this is what we can't get our heads around. It's not static. And yet it's our power to be still that is so precious to us. And we don't realize relaxation is not a muscular default. Relaxation is a conscious, active, dynamic inhibition of motion, of contraction. And people just don't understand these basic physiologies. And I go to teach yoga to yoga schools, to teach all over the place. I teach all sorts of schools, Bowen and all sorts. And the fundamental thing, people still think muscles relax or contract, and they change their minds when they feel like it. No, they only know how to contract. Being still and inhibiting that contraction is a power, and that power of stillness is what biotensegrity is about. And I think before we get off on too much elaborate physics, we've got to come back to understanding the fundamentals of a non-compression based human body to make sense of that. And somebody's asked me, oh, Susan, Joe, please tell us about meeting Danielle Claude Martin, learning with her and building models with her. Was this the first Tensegrity you ever built? Yes, I built Tensegrities when I went to stay with her. She invited me and it was beautiful. Thank you, Anastasi. Yeah, absolutely fabulous. But what is happening in the world that I'm in, which is pretty much on the front line teaching movement and manual therapies, is that we do some very fundamental building of tensegrity structures. We work with balloons, we work with nets, we use our bodies as tensegrities. We do lots of exciting variations because Danielle Claude inspired me to get in motion, to make sense of this motion. That's why John and Wilbur and I all set up the Biotensegrity Summit last March, because I couldn't get my head round sitting there listening to this stuff with the tailbone pins and needles. When we were teaching about movement, we have to be in our movement center. And it's just so important. So building models was an integral part of it. But, and this is a big but, you can't sit a group of yoga teachers down and get them building a tensegrity model and say to them, well, that's how you work. Because there's such, the Rubicon, it's like transporting them from the other side of the river to the other side of the river by light speed, and they need to cross it. They need to go down the bank of 20th century anatomy, across the water and back up the other side to cross the Rubicon. And what I find is that it's fascinating, but we have to get there gradually. And I do, so I get them drawing the flower of life and I'm realizing it contains the yin yang and the excitement in the room. I mean, we've done that, Chris, in a course. You use it in your own courses. You use that mandala, that system that I've showed you. And it's completely about people animating their own inner curiosity. And it's my feeling that we've got a massive amount of work to do in being very compassionate with ourselves, that we're learning an extremely complex subject, deep to Newton's calculus. I mean, calculus is complex, but the man was trying to create a neutral language that would give us access to explaining and progressing with this notion of wholeness and round things. And everything in tensegrity is about round things. And when we understand how round things self-develop and self-assemble, because we're all round things that self-developed and self-assembled, I think we can start resonating with this finely tuned instrument. And I don't think of the human body as an instrument. I think of it as an orchestra. I think the heart is the conductor. I think the brain is the composer. And I think every single aspect of us is a mixture of wind pipes and wind instruments, diaphragms and percussion, string instruments. I think the muscles are the tuning keys, as Steve says, they're the turnbuckles. But because we are all based in tension and compression, most instruments are, we are able to tune in to each other as a collective, to our clients when we're working with them, to our students. We don't walk in and say, right, sit down, I want you all to do some yoga, I want you all to sit still, I want you to put your hands together, I want you in lotus right now, meditate. Come on, hurry up. I mean, how inappropriate would that tune be versus, okay, everybody, let's do a little bit of yawning stretches and let's roll around a little bit and let's find our center and let's bring our attention away from the outside world and let's drop into our inner world and let's take a breath. And then you start playing the pauses and you play a softer tune and you resonate at a slower, lower key and you slow things down and you work appropriately because you're teaching meditation, and then quietly you use what we call yoga nidra. You use your voice as something to bring people into that state of calm. And that for me is the essence of how the fascial architecture is biotensegrily self-organized and self-regulated. And I think there's so much work to do in that field. I'm with Daniel Claude that it's in movement, in the movement classroom. I understand, much as I love learning my anatomy, but that's because I teach manual therapy. I understand why some Feldenkrais schools decline to teach the detailed anatomy. I can totally understand that because they don't want you off in your head understanding. They want you in your body, in your physiology, in your world. But to be there, we have to find a new language and we have to learn what it means. And for example, tension, stiffness. People use the word stiffness as if it's a pathology. Oh, my shoulder's really stiff. Joe, can I come and see you? My shoulder's really stiff. Can you do something with it? And hang on a second. I want you to be sufficient stiffness. This has insufficient stiffness. How do we use that word with wisdom, meaning two very different things as we cross the Rubicon? And crossing that Rubicon is a new language, and it's the language of multi-sensory, multi-dimensional conscious awareness, and it involves body, mind and being, and Biotensegrity offers the map of all of them because it's based in sacred geometry. Just saying.
Anastasia has a question.
No, he's just clapping because he thinks I'm the poet laureate, and I love you for it, Anastasia. Thank you.
I'm looking in the chat when he wrote a question at 2:10.
Oh, sorry, Susan. Anastasia, you wrote a question at 2:10. What is it?
You can unmute yourself. Maybe we can unmute you. Or let's see.
I think he's good. He's giving us a thumbs up. Does anybody else?
Wilbur's question. Wilbur said, Joe,
Yeah.
Is it about feeling the energy rhythm, isn't it? Wilbur, you didn't have to ask that. It's only about rhythm. Listen, if you're making chocolate, you have to care about tempo. Think about it. If you've got a wheel of chocolate and a bath of chocolate, it's a liquid crystal. It has very similar behaviors. I know, well, it is biological, it is organic, but it's not living. But if you move the wheel very, very, very fast, you end up with what we call an aero bar full of bubbles. And if you want to make a really fine bar of chocolate or a really beautiful confection that you bite into and it melts and there's an entire sensory experience, and oh my God, not only is that the sum of a large number of crafted sequences, organized, note the symbolic reference, but it's one of the very important properties is tempo. tempo, the rhythm that you work the chocolate matters, or you will get something that just looks like a pile of goo. Someone had the brainwave when we make piles of goo of sticking rubbish in it, like the leftover nuts and bits of orange peel from the candied peel, and calling it Rocky Road or Rocky Mountain. It's very clever, but actually it's a mistake. And it's the lack of finesse that got okayed. It's brilliant. But everything you want to know about life, you will learn either sailing a boat at sea, which is how I got into Tom Myers School, because I could sail a boat, or you'll learn it in a chocolate factory.
I just want everybody to know I've put it so that if you have something to say, you can unmute yourself. Eleanor, did you want to?
Yeah, I was so moved. Ooh,
hi,
thank
Eleanor.
you. Hi.
you.
Oh my gosh, Joanne, my life. So thank you. This is like, oh, okay, my hair just stood on end thinking of it. You said the Biotensegrity is multi-sensory, multi-something, and multi-awareness. It was so delicious. And I was trying to write it down.
Multi-dimensional. And you're very lucky, because usually I can't remember what I just said. So there's some magic in there that you brought to the table. Thank you, Eleanor.
Thank you.
Multi-dimensional. And when we talk about this, we're in two, so it doesn't work. Go on, Anastasia, sorry.
I now I can unmute myself. I think it was Carol who said she was interested in the 2D, 3D, 4D conversation. And I'm a little interested when you were talking about going up a dimension to go back to understand the prior dimension. So I was curious about 4D anyway. Is it temporal? Is it, what is it? And how do we go to 5D to understand 4D?
Well, 5D, you've got to come to mystery school with me, Anastasia, which you're very welcome to do.
Oh, I'm ready to go.
I'm going to show you what 4D is. One sec. I'm going to get a model. Hold on. That isn't here. Here we go.
Hey, we're all here. We're all into mystery school. This is mystery school.
Mystery school. I'm right. It's mystery school. So that's 2D. Yeah. It's area.
Hang on, Joe. Let me pin you or spotlight you so that people can actually see that. Will you repeat that about the 2D?
Okay, so that's 2D. There's another whole story going on about the angles and the triangles and the spiral, but this is the cutoff piece of fascia, if you will. Yeah. And Carla Stecco would say this is two pieces of fascia. This is the fascia, one rat in that chirality and one rat in that chirality. Yeah. Because everything in the body is actually a tube. So that would be 3D, it would be this. And it also happens to be a closed kinematic chain, but that's another whole discussion. Now, what something in 3D does to move to 4D is move through itself. So if we move this through itself, what we now have is a tube, a torus, a tube made of a tube. Yes? What we also have, because it's given us the extra, I don't want to use the word layers because there are no layers in the human body, but let's pretend we've increased its density or condensed it with more of itself wrapping. That is the model of a spinal disc, an intervertebral spinal disc. And if I then twist it again, because everything in the human body is about rotational forming, I have a model of the so-called anterior and posterior cruciate ligaments. There's no anterior and posterior cruciate ligaments. It's a spiral ligament. Because that's the model of it. And you can, it's a spiral. So you could say it's got a front and a back because some of it faces front and some of it faces back. But it's the same pickle that you get into talking about anatomy trains, because you talk about a front and a back. Well, there isn't a front and a back. That's like with the front and the back of my hand. You know, I can't move the back of my hand without affecting the front of my hand. They're not separate. And please don't get me wrong. I love Tom. I've fought with Tom. I lived with him and his wife for months on end, back and forth. I did 250,000 air miles shadowing him, and I know his work inside out, and I love it and I appreciate it. And he said to me, "You will stand on my shoulders," and I do. I really do. But it's linear, and going from bits to bands is a huge upgrade. But we now have to get from bands to bodies. And this body self-assembled in the round. So that's 4D. So I must be 5D to see that. So to be in this forum, you're already in the 4-dimensional mystery school. And then number 5 is we have to start acknowledging the mental realm and then the etheric realm, and it all gets complicated. But each realm is charged differently, and it's just...
Joe, can you just say where you got the props from?
Robert Schleip gave me a huge bag. Thank you, Robert, just to acknowledge you. And don't let me forget to answer Carol's question about the definitions of fascia. I want to say something about that. Robert Schleip gave me a huge bag of, these go on bottles in duty free. And let me show you something that you can now buy a version of them. Hold on, I've got loads. Hold on. You can buy these online. These are little tiny versions of the same thing. They're beautiful. They're for looking after flowers when they're sent in the post. And what's so wonderful about them is that you can fold them in on themselves. And of course, they self-stiffen. Can you see that?
Center it. Yeah, that's good, Joe.
There you go. So what you're basically making is a torus. What have I done with my... What you're making is one of these out of that. And so when you get that in the middle, because this is equilibrium, whoever talked about equilibrium and asked me about homeostasis, we're never here and we're never here because we don't collapse. We're always a volume. Even if we're dead, we're a volume. So we have to understand the rules of volumes. And so we actually live, can't get this one to stay. It's not stiff enough. We live in the middle because it gives us maximum range. Same with the breath. The ground of the breath is 50% full lung, and we can expand into it, and we can draw in and we can release the breath. And this one isn't a very good one, but it's a model of the whole toroidal pattern. That's 4-dimensional. But to see something in 4-dimensional, some part of you, and it's called in the mystery schools, it's called imaginal muscle, not imagination, not making it up, but using an imaginal awareness of yourself as if you were standing outside of yourself. And that's the purpose of the philosophical schools of yoga. That's why my book is in yoga.
Right. At that point, I think we have to close the meeting. We come to our hour and a half time limit, I'm afraid.
We turn into pumpkins now.
That's right. Thank you so much, Joanne, for being here and explaining things and answering questions. Everybody's clapping. We can't hear all the...
I can't see them.
Unmuted.
Can I just say one very, very quick thing about Carol asked about the definition, and I wrote to Robert Schleip and I said, could you please tell me why bones are not considered in the IFRC nomenclature? Remember, this isn't international nomenclature, this is the IFRC nomenclature. Why bones are not considered to be fascia, because they are so obviously what Steve calls starched fascia. They have hydroxyapatite or calcium. I mean, cut a bone in half, it's only 30% hard crystal. It's just harder crystal, like chocolate when it's gone tempered. And then all the other stuff is like porridge, which is like untempered chocolate. It's exactly the same design, crystalline, liquid crystalline design. It's exactly the same. And Robert wrote back to me, he said, fascia is continuous by definition. The struts in a tensegrity structure are discontinuous. So bones are discontinuous. Therefore, they're not fascia. Which bit isn't attached to bone? Find me a muscle, find me any bone in any body that hasn't, I mean, it's ridiculous. That pet peeve, there aren't origins and insertions. When you've been in the lab, any one of you who've been in the cadaveric lab, everything's attached to everything everywhere. There's nothing, there's no spaces in any cross section in any book. Didn't anyone look at the cross sections and go, oh, because the iconic images of muscles attached to bones give you the feeling that when you walk in the lab, you can cut the origin and the insertion of each muscle and lay it on the table. Well, you can't. It took me a bloody day to dissect a trapezius muscle once because I was so impeccable about it. A day. because every fibre was attached to something everywhere. Peeve over.
Great, wonderful imagery. Thank you so much. We have to finish now because the recording device explodes if we go over
Okay.
too long.
Sorry,
So
I love you all. Mwah, mwah, mwah. Thank you for coming.
thank
Can I
you.
see-
Thank you so much for being here, Joe. And for
No
everybody
problem.
else.
Thank you so much, Joe. Love you.